What if I told you that at this very moment, on a farm north of Jerusalem, there's an animal that could potentially alter the destiny of the entire world? And I'm not talking about something out of a science fiction novel. I'm referring to 3,000-year-old biblical prophecies that are being fulfilled right before our very eyes. We're talking about 5 completely red heifers that were imported from Texas back in September of 2022 and have recently reached the prophetic age of 3 years old. Priests have been undergoing intensive training. Exquisite objects made of gold and silver have been meticulously prepared, and stones have been precisely cut according to the exact measurements laid out in the book of Ezekiel. Furthermore, Jared Kushner, the very same man who achieved the seemingly impossible feat back in 2020 by getting Arab nations to formally recognize Israel, is now back at the negotiating table, working on something even more audacious: sharing the Temple Mount. This, what the Bible refers to as a covenant with many, may very well be happening as we speak. What the prophet Daniel foretold some 2,500 years ago is now being fulfilled, and the world is on the verge of witnessing something that hasn't occurred in a staggering 1,955 years: the return of sacrifices. This isn't just some historical footnote. This is prophecy transforming into tangible reality. Before we dive any deeper, it's essential that you understand the 5 governing rules that dictate everything that's unfolding. These rules have been extracted directly from prophetic scriptures and, according to biblical scholars, must be fulfilled before the return of Christ. Rule number 1, a perfect red heifer must exist. Rule number 2, a peace agreement will precede these prophetic events. Rule number 3, the third temple will be rebuilt. Rule number 4, sacrifices will return. And rule number 5, there will be a personal cost involved. These are the immutable rules, and now let's examine how they are currently being fulfilled. Byron Stinson, a rancher from Texas, never imagined that his humble ranch would one day play a pivotal role in altering prophetic history. As a devout Christian and a dedicated student of Scripture, Byron had always firmly believed in Israel's restoration as a key sign of the end times. So, when he was contacted by the B'nai Israel organization in 2021, seeking perfectly red heifers, something deep inside him resonated, telling him, "This is the very purpose for which God has prepared you." He then embarked on a meticulous month-long inspection of his red Angus cattle. Each and every animal had to be absolutely perfect. Even a single white or black hair would immediately disqualify it. The hose needed to be reddish in hue. Furthermore, the heifer could never have been used for any kind of work, nor could it ever have made it. These were incredibly stringent requirements, almost impossible to fulfill naturally, but against all odds, Byron managed to find 5 such heifers. On September 15, 2022, the 5 heifers, each approximately 11 months old, finally arrived at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. Byron personally accompanied them on their journey. While international media largely overlooked the event, within prophetic Christian and Messianic Jewish circles, it was as if the celestial trumpets had sounded a grand fanfare. As the 5 heifers were carefully unloaded from the cargo plane, Byron heard something distinct, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a cracked bell ringing faintly in the distance. He immediately looked around, but no one else seemed to have noticed or heard it. However, Byron knew in his heart that it was the first tangible sign that Numbers chapter 19 was being fulfilled. The 10th red heifer had arrived. Rule number 1 was now being activated. For the first time in 2,000 long years, perfect candidates for the 10th red heifer actually existed. Byron promptly delivered the heifers into the care of the Temple Institute and then returned to his ranch in Texas. But his role in this unfolding drama was far from over. He used a portion of his personal fortune to acquire a plot of land on the Mount of Olives. And not just any land, but land that meticulously met the exact requirements described in rabbinic texts for sacrifices performed outside the temple: the correct elevation, the correct orientation facing where the Holy of Holies would be situated, and the appropriate distance. Even if the Temple Mount remained inaccessible, it would still be possible to perform the sacred ceremonies on this carefully selected land. While Byron was busy planting these crucial seeds in Texas, Sean Richmond was working tirelessly on the ground in Jerusalem. As the international director of the Temple Institute, Sham had dedicated his entire life to what seemed like an impossible goal: preparing absolutely everything for the day when the temple could finally be rebuilt. Founded in 1987, the Institute wasn't just a museum or an educational organization. It was a vibrant, active laboratory dedicated to biblical restoration. Within the Institute's facilities, located in the Old City, Each and every object described in the scriptures was being meticulously recreated. The menorah, crafted from 95 pounds of pure gold and valued at a staggering $2 million, gleamed brilliantly under specially designed lights. Bronze altars had been precisely cast according to the specifications laid out in the book of Exodus. Levitical musical instruments, including silver trumpets, cymbals, and harps, had all been faithfully recreated according to the detailed descriptions found in Chronicles and Psalms. The priestly garments, with their very specific colors extracted from mollusks and plants identified through meticulous archaeological research, hung in carefully climate-controlled environments. Sham frequently led visitors on tours of the warehouse where all these sacred objects were carefully stored. "We have 102 pieces ready," he would often say with visible satisfaction. "All that's missing is the place to put them." However, there was one critical component that simply couldn't be manufactured or purchased: the ashes of the red heifer. Without these ashes, all the meticulous preparations would ultimately be rendered useless. So, when the 5 heifers finally arrived in September of 2022, Sham wept openly, but not tears of sadness, rather tears of profound prophetic jubilation. Rule number 1 was being fulfilled. God was actively intervening. The Messianic era was drawing ever closer. The heifers were then taken to Shiloh, the ancient spiritual capital of Israel, where the tabernacle had stood for an impressive 369 years. There, under constant supervision, they continued to grow and mature. Rabbis meticulously inspected them on a weekly basis. Mariah Shapi, the manager of the local visitors center, received a constant stream of people daily from all corners of the globe, all eager to catch a glimpse of these special animals. "Visitors come from every continent," she reported. Jews, Christians, even secular, curious individuals. Everyone senses that something truly prophetic is unfolding. The very place where the prophet Samuel had served, where Hannah had fervently prayed for a son, and where Joshua had divided the promised land among the tribes of Israel was now hosting the animals that could potentially inaugurate the long-awaited Messianic era. But not everyone was celebrating. In Messianic Jewish congregations scattered throughout Israel and around the world, alarms were beginning to sound. These were Jews who had accepted Yeshua, Jesus, as the promised Messiah, but who still maintained their Jewish identity and practices. For them, the situation was fraught with spiritual danger. Jesus' ultimate sacrifice on the cross had, in their belief, fulfilled all the sacrifices of the law. Hebrews 10 verse 18 clearly declared, "Now where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin." Restarting animal sacrifices, in their view, was akin to rejecting the complete and perfect work of the Messiah. It was a step backward, returning to shadows when the true reality had already arrived. It was potentially paving the way not for the true Messiah, but for the false one, the Antichrist. Messianic Rabbi David Stern, the author of widely respected biblical commentaries, penned numerous articles warning, "Brothers and sisters, we need to discern the times carefully." Yes, prophecies are indeed being fulfilled. Yes, Israel is absolutely central to God's plan, but rebuilding the temple and restarting sacrifices before Yeshua's return may very well be the exact deception prophesied in 2 Thessalonians. It may be setting the stage for the one who will ultimately sit in the temple and declare himself to be God. His urgent words echoed through blogs, videos, and meetings, but they were largely ignored by those enthusiastic about reconstruction. In October of 2024, the 5 heifers reached the age of 3, marking a critical point. Rule number 1 had reached its critical juncture. The window of opportunity was now open. According to rabbinic calculations, they needed to be sacrificed sometime after the beginning of their 3rd year, but before their 4th, when the probability of them developing hairs of other colors increased dramatically. The prophetic clock was ticking. The first sign had fully materialized, and in private rooms, far removed from the prying eyes of cameras and reporters, conversations about the seemingly impossible began to take place. Conversations about agreements, about sharing the Temple Mount, and about rebuilding the 3rd temple. These conversations were being mediated by a man who had already achieved the improbable before, Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner possessed an understanding of the complexities of the Middle East that few Western politicians could ever hope to grasp. As an Orthodox Jew himself, he wasn't just an external negotiator. He deeply comprehended the profound religious importance of every single stone in Jerusalem. As Donald Trump's son-in-law, he had served as a senior advisor during Trump's first administration from 2017 to 2021. It was during this very period that he orchestrated what many considered to be an impossible feat, the Abraham Accords. On September 15, 2020, Israel and the United Arab Emirates formally normalized their diplomatic relations. For the first time in history, an Arab Gulf nation openly recognized the State of Israel. Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan soon followed suit. The entire Middle East paradigm had undergone a significant shift. However, Kushner had always known that the real prize was Saudi Arabia. If Riyadh, the guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, were to normalize relations with Israel, the rest of the Arab world would almost certainly follow. Negotiations had progressed significantly before Trump left office in January of 2021. Now, in 2025, with Trump back in the presidency, Kushner was back in action. While not officially serving in the government this time, he operated as a special envoy, working discreetly through parallel diplomatic channels. He flew tirelessly between Washington, Jerusalem, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Cairo. Each trip represented another step forward. Each meeting fostered greater trust. The proposal that Kushner carried was nothing short of audacious, to expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia, but with some truly revolutionary components. Saudi-Israeli normalization would, of course, require concessions to the Palestinians. That was well understood. But there was another element as well, an element that would make history not just politically, but prophetically, shared administration of the Temple Mount. The idea was technically complex, but conceptually quite simple. The Jordanian WF would continue to maintain control over the mosques, but at specific times, specific areas would be opened up for Jewish ceremonies, not just silent prayer, but eventually rituals and even construction. This, Kushner argued, would be the definitive demonstration of coexistence, portraying Jerusalem as a truly shared city. It would also be, though he didn't state it publicly, a fulfillment of Daniel 9 verse 27. The Saudis, naturally, had their own conditions: a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, a complete settlement freeze, massive American infrastructure investments, and robust security guarantees against Iran, all of which were negotiable. What the Israelis wanted in return was perfectly clear: access to the Temple Mount and, eventually, its reconstruction. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, an astute politician who had navigated the complexities of the Middle East for decades, saw the immense opportunity. His coalition included religious parties that fervently dreamed of rebuilding the temple. Delivering on this promise would solidify his legacy forever. It would be like David purchasing Araunah's threshing floor. It would be like Cyrus decreeing the return of the exiles. It would be like Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple. It would be biblical history unfolding in real time. In March of 2025, leaks began to emerge, first in Israeli newspapers, then in Arab media, and finally in the international press. Historic agreement being negotiated. Temple Mount may be shared. Kushner mediates secret negotiations. These leaks were far from accidental. They were calculated tests designed to gauge public reaction. The reaction was generally measured. Extremist groups on both sides immediately denounced the agreement. Hamas called it a betrayal, while radical Israeli settlers deemed it an unacceptable concession. However, mainstream reactions were cautiously optimistic. The weariness with endless conflict was palpable, and the desire for lasting peace was genuine. And Kushner knew precisely how to leverage that dynamic. While diplomacy unfolded in the capitals, prophetic events were rapidly accelerating in Jerusalem. In April of 2025, during the Jewish Passover, something extraordinary occurred. The Sanhedrin, an assembly of rabbis that had been reestablished in 2004, called for a Passover sacrifice, not on the Temple Mount, still inaccessible for such a purpose, but on the Mount of Olives, on the very property that Byron Stinson had acquired. On the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar, a lamb was sacrificed by a certified Cohen, wearing the appropriate garments. As the knife touched the lamb's throat, Byron heard it again, that low, distant sound of a cracked bell, but this time louder and more insistent. He looked at the faces around him. Some showed pure joy, while others displayed uncertainty. The sound seemed to pose a question: preparation or deception? It was the second sign, ambiguous and troubling. Levites played silver trumpets, and dozens of families participated, roasting and eating the lamb. According to Exodus 12, it was the first Passover sacrifice in 1,955 years. The second prophetic sign had now manifested. Byron Stinson watched the sacrifice with deeply conflicting emotions. Part of him marveled at witnessing biblical prophecy unfold before his very eyes, at seeing Israel's restoration and the fulfillment of ancient promises. However, another part of him, the part that diligently read the New Testament every day, felt a growing sense of discomfort. Jesus was the Lamb of God. The Passover sacrifice pointed directly to him. Wouldn't renewing physical sacrifices be tantamount to denying the spiritual sacrifice? Byron began studying the books of Daniel, Revelation, and Thessalonians with renewed intensity. What had he read about the covenant with many? What had Paul written about the man of sin? What if he, with the best of intentions, was inadvertently facilitating not the coming of the Messiah, but the arrival of the Antichrist? Sean Richmond, on the other hand, harbored no such doubts. For him, the Passover sacrifice was nothing short of glorious. It was a rehearsal for the day when the temple would be ready and daily sacrifices could be restored. The Temple Institute meticulously documented every single aspect of the event. Videos were posted online, articles were written, donations increased significantly, and enthusiasm grew exponentially. And when Sean learned of Kushner's negotiations, of the ongoing conversations about sharing the Temple Mount, he saw the unmistakable hand of God at work. Everything is aligning perfectly, he said in numerous interviews. The heifers are ready. The objects are ready. The priests are trained. Now, the political path is opening up. We are witnessing the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecies. However, in Messianic congregations, David Stern and other leaders intensified their warnings. They organized conferences, published detailed studies, and appeared on podcasts. Brothers and sisters, Stern pleaded, please read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 carefully. It will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of sin is revealed. He will sit in God's temple, wanting to appear as God himself. Don't you see? The temple will be rebuilt, but not by God. It will be rebuilt for the Antichrist to sit there. And this peace agreement, this covenant with many, is exactly what Daniel prophesied. His urgent words were heard by some, ignored by many, and ridiculed by others. In July of 2025, one of the 5 heifers developed 2 black hairs and was therefore disqualified. However, the Temple Institute didn't waste the opportunity. On July 8th, they conducted a complete rehearsal of the ritual described in Numbers chapter 19. The heifer was sacrificed and burned outside the camp according to the scriptures. The priests meticulously practiced every movement and every word. When the moment finally came with a kosher heifer, everything would need to be absolutely perfect. The 4 remaining heifers remained flawless. Time was running out, and in the negotiation rooms, Jared Kushner presented the final documents. The agreement was almost sealed. The covenant with many was being confirmed. Rule number 2 was being fulfilled. And virtually no one, except for a handful of Messianic Jews, seemed to perceive the prophetic danger of what was unfolding. The fall of 2025 brought a dramatic transformation to the Middle East political scene. In September, during meetings held parallel to the UN General Assembly in New York, Jared Kushner achieved what once seemed utterly impossible. Gathered in a private hotel suite, representatives from Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and Jordan signed a memorandum of understanding, officially called the Jerusalem Agreement for Lasting Peace. The 20-page document established some truly revolutionary principles: full normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, a Palestinian state with administrative autonomy in agreed-upon areas, and the most explosive component of all, tripartite administration of the Temple Mount, involving the Jordanian WF, Israeli authorities, and an international oversight committee. Paragraph 7.3 of the agreement specifically stated, recognizing the historical and religious importance of the site for multiple Abrahamic traditions, a rotating access system will be established that allows Jewish ceremonies at designated times without interfering with the 5 daily Islamic prayers, respecting the sanctity of the site for all peoples. It was carefully crafted diplomatic language, but everyone understood precisely what it meant. Jews could now perform rituals on the Temple Mount and potentially build. Byron Stinson read the news at his ranch in Texas with a divided heart. On one hand, peace in the Middle East was something he had prayed for fervently for decades. On the other hand, the words of Daniel 9 verse 27 echoed in his mind like distant thunder. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. One prophetic week equaled 7 years. The agreement specifically mentioned an initial 7-year implementation period. The prophetic mathematics aligned perfectly. Byron immediately called his contacts in Israel, Messianic rabbis he knew and prophecy scholars. "Are you seeing this?" he asked urgently. "Isn't this exactly what Daniel described?" Sean Richmond, in stark contrast, was absolutely exultant. The day after the agreement was announced, the Temple Institute held a massive celebration at its facilities. Hundreds of people attended, with music, dancing, and heartfelt prayers of gratitude filling the air. This is Cyrus declaring that the temple can be rebuilt. Sham declared to the enthusiastic crowd. This is Artaxerxes sending Nehemiah back to Jerusalem. We are witnessing biblical history unfolding before our very eyes. He announced that the Institute would intensify its preparations even further. More priests would be trained, architectural plans would be finalized, and the 4 remaining Red Heifers would be monitored even more closely. Everything needed to be ready for the moment when political authorization became practical reality. Jared Kushner gave very few interviews after the agreement was signed. When asked about Jewish access to the Temple Mount, he chose his words carefully. This agreement respects all religious traditions. Jerusalem is a holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It's possible, with goodwill from all parties, to find arrangements that honor everyone. He deliberately avoided any language about rebuilding the temple. However, in diplomatic circles, everyone understood that the agreement had created a legal and political pathway for it. For the first time since the year 70 AD, rebuilding the Third Temple had moved from the abstract realm of theological debate into the concrete domain of practical possibility. The Palestinian reaction was one of fury and betrayal. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, denounced the agreement as a complete surrender to occupation. Hamas issued threatening statements, and Hezbollah intensified its rhetoric. However, the geopolitical reality was abundantly clear. Diplomatically isolated, economically weak, and militarily outmatched, the Palestinians had very little leverage. The Sunni Arab powers, primarily concerned about the growing threat of Iran and keenly interested in Western investments and Israeli technology, had decided that decades of rejectionism had led nowhere. It was time for a new approach. During Sukkot of 2025, something extraordinary took place in Jerusalem. For the first time in decades, a group of more than 500 people, including Levites in traditional garments playing ancient instruments, performed the water libation ceremony. Starting at the Dung Gate in the Old City, the procession descended to the Pool of Siloam. A Kohen carried a golden vessel filled with crystalline water. The procession sang, danced, and celebrated, just as described in the Second Temple period texts. At the very high point of the ceremony, at sunrise, a rainbow appeared over Jerusalem. For many participants, it was an unmistakable divine sign. God was blessing the process, and restoration had been celestially approved. Mariah Shopi in Shiloh reported that visits to see the Red Heifers had tripled after the agreement announcement. "People come crying," she recounted. "They say they've waited their whole lives for this moment." Grandparents bring their grandchildren. They share stories of when Jerusalem was reunified in 1967, of when they visited the Western Wall for the very first time, and now they say, maybe we'll actually see the temple rebuilt before we die. The emotion was palpable, visceral, and deeply religious. However, in Messianic congregations, the atmosphere was entirely different. Emergency meetings were called, fasts were declared, and intercession was intensified. Leaders studied prophecies with renewed urgency. A Messianic rabbi known for his eschatological writings published a series of detailed articles. "Brothers and sisters, we need to understand the prophetic sequence," he wrote. "Yes, the temple will be rebuilt, but when and by whom matters greatly. If it's rebuilt before Yeshua's return, without Israel's national repentance, without collective recognition that they pierced the Messiah, then it's being built not for the true Messiah, but for the false one." He cited Zechariah 12 verse 10, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him." This national repentance hadn't yet occurred. The majority of Israel still rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So, how could the temple being built now be the true Messianic temple? It must be, he argued, the tribulation temple mentioned in Daniel and Revelation, the temple where the Antichrist would ultimately sit. Byron Stinson read these articles and felt a growing sense of weight. He began carefully reviewing his participation, his heifers, his land. Had his initial excitement inadvertently facilitated the fulfillment not of God's promises, but of God's warnings? He spent countless nights in prayer, wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he made a firm decision. He would fly to Israel. He would speak personally with Shalom Richmond, with Messianic leaders, and with everyone involved. He needed to understand clearly. He needed to be absolutely sure, because the cost of being wrong was simply too high. In November of 2025, the Sanhedrin announced that it was forming a commission to establish a timeline for Third Temple construction. Architects were hired and engineers were consulted. The announcement mentions Sukkot of 2026, just 1 year ahead, as a possible date for the cornerstone laying ceremony. If the political agreement held, if the necessary authorizations were granted, and if everything aligned perfectly, construction could indeed begin. The prophetic clock was accelerating, the ticking clock had been set, and the world watched with bated breath, some with hope, others with dread, but all recognizing that something unprecedented was unfolding. March of 2026 marked a crucial turning point. Jared Kushner orchestrated a summit meeting in Abu Dhabi that brought together leaders from 17 nations, including Israel, all the Abraham Accord signatories, major European powers, and American representatives. The official objective was to discuss the implementation of the Jerusalem Agreement. The undeclared objective, however, was to finalize the crucial details surrounding the Temple Mount. For 3 intense days at an isolated resort, intense negotiations took place, covering security questions, logistics, international oversight, and specific timelines. On the 3rd day, a joint communiqué was issued. Implementation would begin in phases. Phase 1 would involve expanded Jewish access for individual prayer. Phase 2 would allow for small religious ceremonies at designated times. Phase 3 would focus on archaeological exploration in specified areas, and Phase 4 would involve consideration of permanent structures. The language regarding permanent structures was deliberately vague, but everyone understood that it potentially meant the temple itself. The communiqué also established an international oversight committee composed of representatives from the UN, the Arab League, the European Union, and the United States to monitor implementation and prevent violations. It would be this committee, not just Israel or the WF, that would authorize any advances to each subsequent phase. It was a structure designed to distribute responsibility and, theoretically, to distribute the blame if something went horribly wrong. Byron Stinson arrived in Israel just 1 week after the Abu Dhabi summit. He first visited Shiloh and saw the heifers he had so generously donated. They were beautiful, healthy, and perfectly red. Then he traveled to Jerusalem and met with Shalom Richmond at the Temple Institute. The conversation was long, intense, and deeply emotional. Byron, Shalom said, "You are God's instrument in all of this. Without these heifers, none of this would have been possible. You are a vital part of redemption history." Byron took a deep breath and replied, "Shalom, have you carefully read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2? What Paul says about the man of sin sitting in God's temple?" Shalom simply waved his hand dismissively. "Those are just Christian interpretations that don't really apply. The temple will be for the worship of the God of Israel. When the Messiah comes, he'll find it ready and waiting." Byron then met with Messianic leaders. The conversation was markedly different. They validated his deep concerns. Byron, one of them said, "You acted with a pure heart. God can even use our mistakes for his glory. But now that you see the bigger picture, what are you going to do?" Byron had no immediate answer. He returned to Texas, more confused than when he had left. All that remained for him to do was to pray fervently and watch closely how events would ultimately unfold. In April of 2026, during Passover preparation, the Sanhedrin made an electrifying announcement that sent shockwaves through the Orthodox Jewish world. One of the 4 remaining red heifers had been selected for sacrifice. Rabbis had meticulously inspected her and confirmed that she was perfect, completely red, without any blemish, never used for work, and now 4.5 years old. She was within the permitted window, but time was definitely limited. The sacrifice would be performed on the Mount of Olives, on Byron's land, during the period between Passover and Shavuot. According to halakhic considerations, the ashes would be kept in a special container. When access to the Temple Mount was finally authorized, these ashes would be used to purify the priests, the sacred objects, and the entire space. Everything could then begin in earnest. Shalom Richmond worked day and night, meticulously preparing for the upcoming ritual. Every detail from Scripture was studied with unwavering focus. Every movement was carefully choreographed. and every word was meticulously memorized. The Cohen who had been designated to perform the sacrifice fasted rigorously, purified himself as best as permitted without prior ashes, and studied ancient texts diligently. The cedar wood and scarlet wool specified in Numbers chapter 19 were carefully obtained. A platform was constructed on the Mount of Olives, oriented precisely toward where the Holy of Holies would ultimately be located on the Temple Mount. On the designated day, approximately 2,000 people gathered on the Mount of Olives. Israeli authorities provided heavy security to maintain order, and Palestinian protests in nearby areas were effectively contained. At dawn, the Red Heifer was brought forth. The Cohen, wearing simple white garments, approached the animal. He placed his hands on her head, as prescribed. Then, with precise and deliberate movements, he performed the sacrifice. As the heifer's blood touched the earth, Byron heard the cracked bell sound for the third time. But this time, it wasn't distant or questioning. It was loud, clear, and utterly final, like a door either slamming shut or swinging wide open. The sound reverberated throughout the valley, and though no one else seemed to hear it, Byron knew in his heart that it was the third sign, the point of no return. The covenant was now being sealed in. Blood and ash. The animal was completely burned, along with cedar, hyssop, and scarlet wool. The process took hours. The ashes were carefully collected, divided into 3 portions according to tradition, and kept in sealed ceramic vessels. The 10th red heifer in history had been sacrificed. Rule 1 was complete. Jubilation exploded among the participants. Songs, dances, prayers. "Now we're ready," people shouted. "When the way opens, we can purify everything." Videos of the event spread instantly. Evangelical Christians saw prophetic fulfillment. Orthodox Jews saw redemption approaching. Secularists saw worrying religious fanaticism. Muslims saw intolerable provocation. And Messianic Jews saw confirmation of their worst fears. The stage was being set for the final deception. But what happened 2 days later changed everything. Jared Kushner, coordinating with the International Oversight Committee, announced that Phase 2 implementation would begin immediately. Jewish ceremonies on the Temple Mount would be permitted starting the next Shavuot. A specific area away from the mosques would be designated. Initially only prayers and Torah study, but precedent would be established. The door would be open, and for the first time in 1,956 years, Jews could worship at their religion's holiest site. The announcement was the definitive midpoint, the point of no return. Before it, everything was preparation and possibility. After it was reality and unstoppable momentum. Prophecy was no longer theological abstraction. It was a newspaper headline. It was international politics. It was fact on the ground. And reactions were immediate and polarized. Israel celebrated. Palestinians raged. Arab nations signatory to the agreement expressed concerns but maintained commitments. Iran denounced. Turkey protested. Western powers called for restraint from all sides. And on social media, intense debates exploded about whether they were witnessing divine prophetic fulfillment or imminent prophetic disaster. Byron Stinson watched Kushner's announcement on television. His hands trembled. Everything he had provided, the heifers, the land, was directly connected to this. He had no more doubts. This was Daniel's covenant with many. A 7-year agreement, temple access, sacrifices being prepared, and a charismatic mediator respected by many, facilitating everything. Kushner wasn't ill-intentioned. Byron believed that, but he was fulfilling a prophetic role he probably didn't even recognize. Byron made a decision. He would use his platform, his contacts, his voice to warn. He would speak publicly. He would try to make people understand what was really happening. Shai Richmond, meanwhile, was euphoric. The Temple Institute issued a formal statement. "We are ready. The objects are ready. The priests are trained. The red heifer ashes have been obtained. When authorization comes in days, not months, we can begin service. And when construction is authorized, we have complete plans. The third temple can be erected in a matter of years, not decades." The statement ended with a quotation from Haggai 2 verse 9. "The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house." The ticking clock advanced inexorably. Shavuot, when the first Jewish ceremonies would happen on the Temple Mount, was weeks away. Sukkot of 2026, when construction could potentially begin, was months away. And everyone, believers and skeptics, religious and secular, felt they were at a historical inflection point. Something was unfolding that would change not just the Middle East, but the entire world. And depending on your theological perspective, it was either the greatest blessing or the greatest danger of the last 2,000 years. Shavuot of 2026 dawned clear over Jerusalem. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, as the sun rose over the Mount of Olives, a group of 50 Jews, including 10 Kohanim in priestly garments, ascended to the Temple Mount. They were escorted by heavy Israeli security, but also accompanied by international observers from the Oversight Committee. The designated area was at the southern end of the esplanade, away from the dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was a small space, perhaps 30 square meters, marked by discrete barriers, but it was space on the Temple Mount. And for the first time since the year 70, Jews were there not as silent visitors, but as authorized worshipers. The service was simple: Torah reading, psalm recitation, the priestly blessing pronounced by the Kohanim. There were no sacrifices. That wasn't yet permitted. No musical instruments, considered too provocative, just human voices praying in Hebrew at the place their ancestors considered the dwelling of God's presence. When they finished about 45 minutes later, they descended without incidents, without violence, but with precedent established. They had worshipped on the Temple Mount, and they would do so again. Reaction was surprisingly contained. Palestinian protests were smaller than anticipated, partially because security was overwhelming, partially because Palestinian leadership was divided and weak, partially because the status quo had been accepted months earlier with the agreement, but mainly because many Palestinians, exhausted by decades of conflict, were beginning to accept reality. Israel wasn't going anywhere. And perhaps, just perhaps, sharing was better than total exclusion. It wasn't satisfaction, it was resignation, but it resulted in less violence than feared. Byron Stinson, watching live broadcasts from Texas, felt nausea, not from anger against the participants, but from prophetic sadness. He posted on his blog, "Brothers, we are witnessing 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 unfold. It will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. The temple is being prepared not for God, for the impostor. His words were read by thousands, ignored by millions." Shai Richmond, in contrast, celebrated. The Temple Institute organized a Thanksgiving event. "We are living in the redemption era," he declared. "Our grandparents dreamed of this day. Our parents prayed for it, and we are seeing it. Within months, when construction is authorized, we'll see stones being laid. Within years, we'll see the complete temple. And then the Messiah will come." The audience applauded, cried, embraced. For them, it was the fulfillment of generations of hope. During the summer of 2026, ceremonies on the Temple Mount became regular. Initially weekly, then several times weekly. The designated space increased slightly. Musical instruments were eventually permitted, Levites playing harps and cymbals. Each time more people participated, each time it became more normalized. And each time construction conversations became more concrete. In August, the Sanhedrin formally presented to the Israeli government and the International Oversight Committee complete architectural plans for the Third Temple. The document was over 300 pages. It included floor plans, elevations, material specifications, construction timelines, budgets, everything based on Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, with rabbinic interpretations on ambiguities. The design blended scriptural fidelity with modern engineering, reinforced concrete foundations, invisible electrical and hydraulic systems, but externally it would be indistinguishable from biblical descriptions. Jerusalem stone, Lebanese cedars, gold, silver, bronze in specified places. The estimated cost was $2 billion. Donations already exceeded $500 million. Major donors included diaspora Jews, American evangelicals, ironically, many of whom believed building the temple was an end-time sign, and even some secular investors who saw tourist potential. The projected timeline was 5 years for total completion, but phases could be functional before that. An altar could be operational in 6 months. Daily sacrifices could begin in 1 year. The complete temple in 5. The plans were submitted to intense scrutiny. Engineers evaluated structural feasibility. Archaeologists debated the precise location. Religious scholars from multiple traditions were consulted. And slowly, over weeks, provisional consensus emerged. Technically, it was viable. Religiously, it respected Islamic sensitivities by avoiding existing structures. Politically, it depended on collective will. The big question wasn't can it be done, but should it be done? That question divided the world. Orthodox and Messianic Jews said absolutely yes. Secular Jews said absolutely no. Evangelical Christians were divided. Some believed it was God's will, others that it was a satanic trap. Muslims almost universally said no, but power dynamics favored those saying yes. Israel controlled the territory. International agreements provided cover. Religious determination provided fuel. And so, inexorably, momentum built. In September 2026, 2 weeks before Sukkot, the International Oversight Committee issued a historic decision. After careful deliberation, extensive consultation, and consideration of all perspectives, they authorized Phase 4 to start. Archaeological exploration could begin immediately in the designated area. If no sensitive findings were discovered, construction of the initial structure, specifically an altar, could begin by year's end. It wasn't authorization for the entire temple, but it was a green light for the first concrete step. News was received with euphoria by some, horror by others. Byron Stinson published a lengthy article, "Brothers, the 7-year covenant was signed in 2025. We are now in 2026. In the middle of the week, in 2028 or 29, Daniel prophesies that he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. We have 3 years, maybe less, before the covenant is broken. 3 years before the Great Tribulation begins. Don't you see?" His words circulated in Christian prophetic circles, but were largely ignored by the mainstream. Shai Richmond, in a televised interview, was asked about concerns that building the temple could trigger violence or even regional war. His response was categorical. For 2,000 years, we've been told to wait. Wait for the Messiah. Wait for God to act. But God gave us a commandment. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. It's our duty to obey. Building the temple doesn't cause conflict. Conflict exists because we rejected it for so long. When the temple is complete, when sacrifices are happening, when God's presence dwells among us again, there will be peace. True peace. Sukkot of 2026 was different from any other in 2 millennia. At the opening ceremony, held not just near but partially on the Temple Mount, 10,000 people participated. Political rulers, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, were present. Israeli chief rabbis pronounced blessings, and in a carefully choreographed moment, a stone was symbolically placed in the designated area. It wasn't the temple cornerstone, not yet, but it was a marker. It was a promise. It was a beginning. The third prophetic sign had fully manifested, and the world watched, knowing they had crossed a point from which there was no easy return. The first months of 2027 brought a frenetic pace of activity. Archaeological excavations on the Temple Mount revealed foundations from earlier periods, confirming historical texts, but discovering nothing preventing construction. In March, final authorization was granted. Altar construction could begin. And in April, exactly 2 years after the first Passover sacrifice on the Mount of Olives, the altar cornerstone was laid on the Temple Mount. Jerusalem stone extracted from specific quarries, cut according to Exodus 20 verse 25 specifications. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. Altar construction took 3 months, each stone positioned according to precise calculations. Workers were instructed in purity laws. Work stopped for Shabbat. Prayers were offered daily. And in July 2027, the altar was complete. 5 meters long, 5 wide, 3 high, according to specifications, a ramp instead of steps as prescribed, horns at the 4 corners, beautiful, solemn, laden with meaning, and now it only awaited fire. Byron Stinson learned preparations for the first sacrifice on the new altar were advancing. He made one final attempt, flew again to Israel, met again with Chaim Richmond. The conversation was tense. "Chaim," Byron said, "you're building the tribulation temple. You're preparing the place where the Antichrist will sit. Please read the complete scriptures. Not just the Tanakh, but the Brit Hadashah too." Chaim was visibly irritated. "Byron, you were crucial in bringing the Heifers, but you don't understand Jewish theology. There's no Antichrist. There's only the Messiah, and when he comes, he'll validate us." Byron left the meeting knowing he'd done what he could. Now only prayer remained and watching events unfold. The first sacrifice on the new altar was scheduled for Rosh Hashanah 2027, the beginning of the Jewish year 5788. It would be an elevation sacrifice, an olah, according to Leviticus chapter 1, a lamb without defect. The Cohen had been purified with red heifer ashes. The garments were ready. the wood prepared, everything according to specifications. And on the designated day, at the Jewish New Year beginning at dawn, it happened. The first sacrifice on the Temple Mount in 1,957 years. Fire rose from the altar, smoke ascended, prayers were offered, and for the participants it was as if heaven opened and God accepted the offering. But what Jared Kushner said 3 days later shocked the world. In an international network interview, he declared, "The altar is functional. This proves the agreement works. Jews and Muslims can share sacred space. Now we enter the next phase." He continued, "The International Oversight Committee, consulting all parties, has authorized complete temple construction to start. It won't be quick. It will take years, but it begins. Because if we can have peace with sacrifices happening, we can have peace with a complete temple." It was an announcement that changed everything. The altar was the beginning. The temple would be the inevitability. Reactions were predictably explosive. Euphoric celebration in Israel. Furious denunciations from Palestinian groups. Iran and Turkey issued severe warnings. Russia and China expressed grave concerns. But the United States, under Trump, fully supported it. The Abraham Accords nations held firm, though cautious. And so, despite the protests, despite the threats, momentum continued. Byron Stinson watched Kushner's interview and felt terrible prophetic confirmation. Everything he'd read, studied, feared was happening. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Kushner, probably without realizing it, was fulfilling a prophetic role, not because he was evil, but because he was being used. And what would come after, in the middle of the week, in 3 years or less, would be catastrophic. Covenant breaking, sacrifice cessation, the abomination of desolation, the Great Tribulation. Byron began preparing his family and community, not physically, though some Christians did, but spiritually, watch and pray. Jesus had said it was time to do exactly that. Chaim Richmond, in contrast, was at his peak. He was appointed principal consultant for temple construction. Plans he'd helped develop were being implemented. International architects, elite engineers, specialized craftsmen, all hired. Work would begin in phases. First support structures, then outer courts, gradually moving inward until finally the Holy of Holies. The revised timeline estimated 7 years for total completion. The irony wasn't lost on prophetic observers. 7 years, exactly the duration of Daniel's week. During Sukkot 2027, a temple construction site consecration ceremony was held. Tens of thousands participated. World leaders sent messages, and in a moment charged with emotion and meaning, the first stone of the main structure was laid. Chants of Psalm 127 echoed, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." For those present, God was building. For those absent, especially Messianic Jews and alert Christians, the predicted deception was being fulfilled. In the following months, as construction advanced, something unexpected began happening, growing unity among Israeli Jews. Secularists, previously indifferent, began feeling a connection. It was heritage, history, identity. Even without deep religious belief, seeing the temple rise awakened something primal. And this unity strengthened national determination. Israel, often internally divided, found cohesion in a common project. But beyond the borders, tensions escalated. Jihadist groups intensified their rhetoric. Iran increased support to proxies. Sporadic terrorist attacks occurred. Nothing on the scale of total war, but persistent violence. The agreement kept a lid on things on the surface, but underground pressures grew. And prophecy scholars noted all this was consistent with biblical descriptions of peace before sudden destruction. Byron Stinson, now deeply involved in a ministry warning about eschatological events, traveled, preaching. "Brothers," he said, "the temple is being built. The 7-year covenant is in force. We're somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd year." In the middle of the week, Daniel says sacrifices will cease. That means in 2028 or 29. Stay alert. Prepare spiritually. What comes is the Great Tribulation, followed by Jesus' glorious return. But before that, there will be unprecedented suffering. Some listened, many ignored. Chaim Richmond, in contrast, saw only glory ahead. In interviews, he declared, "When the temple is complete, when daily sacrifices are happening, when God's presence dwells in the Holy of Holies, the world will transform." Isaiah prophesied, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established, and all nations will stream to it." This is our hope. This is our future. And for millions, his words inspired and motivated. As 2028 approached, temple construction accelerated. Walls rose. Structures took shape. Visitors came from around the world just to see. Live broadcasts showed daily progress. And slowly, inexorably, prophecy was fulfilled. Not as many expected, not the way many desired, but exactly as described in 2,500-year-old texts. Daniel was right. Ezekiel was right. Paul was right. Jesus was right. And now the world witnessed their words materializing in stone, blood, and diplomacy. Byron Stinson looked at the calendar, the middle of the week approaching, and he prayed intensely, "Lord, open your people's eyes. Open Israel's eyes. May they recognize the deception before it's too late. And come, Lord Jesus, come quickly." Chaim Richmond looked at the complete temple model in his office, and he prayed, "Rabono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, we're fulfilling your will. We're building your house now. Send us the Messiah. May he come and dwell among us." Two men, the same events, opposite interpretations, but both agreeing on one point. Something prophetic, something historic, something definitive was happening. And everyone worldwide would have to decide what it meant, because neutrality was no longer an option. The temple was rising, sacrifices were happening, and prophecy was being fulfilled. The only question was for glory or judgment, for redemption or tribulation. And each person would have to answer for themselves. And you, seeing all this unfold in real time, how do you interpret it? Is it the fulfillment of a divine promise or a harbinger of prophetic deception? Are the sacrifices on the temple mount a glorious restoration or a terrible preparation? Is Jared Kushner an agent of peace or an unwitting catalyst of eschatological events? Leave your comment, share your vision, and most importantly, be prepared, because if the Bible is right and everything indicates it is, we're in the final chapters of human history as we know it. And the next act will be the most dramatic of all.